just start to recap. Last week we were talking about a little bit about what really happened to the Jewish people, after the destruction of the temple and all their wanderings, and how the characteristic of this persona of Sephardic Jewry came about. And the title of the class is how these luminaries led to eventually to the development of Eretz Israel and how they played a part. So before we talk about the 1800s and how these people really affected history, talk about their personalities. And we're looking backwards in history. I feel like we have 8 weeks. We have time to talk about the characteristics and how we bring these personality traits and the skills that we learn from a unique experience. Every community has a unique experience. How they bring it along and comes down to bear in the modern world that we're living in today. So we were talking about how in ancient and in medieval times, a lot of the cultures are, there's a tension. Some cultures are bent on conformity, complete conformity, and some cultures are more interested in just like acquiescing to power, pay your taxes. We don't really care what you believe and where you worship. So we said that Romans and Greeks, they had different ideas about that. Greeks were, beginning, they were putting Hellenism on the Jews, and they were like, everybody, now once we've taken over your country, you really have to conform to our thinking, and you should join us, and that's desirable for the empire to grow and flourish. Everybody must be the same, and of course we fought against that. So we were jumping to medieval times, and we were talking about during the Arab conquest. We talked a little bit about how that came about, and how when they came to, in a very short time, they took over the Arabian Peninsula, how they came to the north of Arabia, and which is the area that we know as Eretz Israel, the Sinai, and where Jerusalem is. And when they reached southern Israel, when they got to the cities of Hebron, there were Jews there, and the Byzantine Christians were in charge. And the Arab hordes basically liberated the city of Hebron, and we have writings where Arab historians write down these stories, how they went and they said to the Jews that were there, work with us, show us the weak points of the city, and we will allow you to worship. We will make a pact with you, so we'll be tolerant with you in our society, in our ruling of the city, not like the Byzantines were, about you, always pressing you to convert, and we will leave you alone, and you will be a protected people called dhimmi. So I don't want to recap every single thing. They did this in the city of Hebron. They did this in the city of Jerusalem. And they even did it when they went across North Africa, and they jumped over what we think of as the Straits of Gibraltar to Spain. And the writings are in these major cities, how the Jews were always this fifth column. And they basically did help the Muslim armies liberate these places. They gave them tolerance. The Byzantine Christians, and even all the way in Spain, they were oppressing Jews. And we even talked about how in the 300s, when Spain became a Christian area at that moment in time, the bishops, they were extremists in their views, and their crackdown was so much that they even, to the point of persecuting Jews, to the point of they made them forcibly convert in Spain. This is the 300s, the 4th century already. And the Jews have a discussion, can we do this fake converting thing? So they don't often talk about it to confuse people about the 1400s, what goes on later. But there were already people thinking about, I'll secretly be Jewish, because the Christians want homogeny. They want one society. The Arabs, I'll show you this map. This is a picture of Spain, and you could see the Arabs conquered all the way They really actually went further than this line, and they went all the way up to Paris, almost 10 miles outside of Paris. They almost conquered. And the historians always like to say, at that moment, the battles and Charlemagne, we would have had a completely different history had the Arabs taken over Europe, had they taken over the city of Paris. But they beat them back. Right. In a different way through immigration. So obviously the burnt, brown is the Arab conquest, and the Jews helped them do this. And this is the height in the 9th century. So they made good on the promise to give them rights, and in this upwardly mobile society. Different characters. We have very famously, I'll talk about a couple of them, Hasdai ibn Shaprut. He was a man that basically reached the level of foreign secretary. Our Secretary of State who deals with all foreign relations for the head the head of the caliphate. For the religious leader at this time is also the ruler of Spain. His name is Abd el-Rahman, the servant of the merciful one. His name, I always say, could have been Bob. We don't know. But once he reached the title, that's the persona that his name is. And he seems to be the grandson of the original conqueror. And this man, Hasdai ibn Shaprut, was a Jew, and he became the head, he was the best advisor, and he became basically the Secretary of State for this entire caliphate. What was going on here? Spain is a beautiful place. It was very full of natural resources. You can imagine these Muslims coming from the Middle East. That's very dry. Very, water is lacking in many places, very rough terrain. And here's just farmlands and mountains and rivers and water. And it was always known this, even in Roman times. But when the Christians took it over, they mismanaged a lot of it. And they let a lot of the Roman aqueducts and fortifications and cities go into disrepair. And they didn't, you get this sense that the rulers for about 300 years had really let things fall. And there was no organization of how to get food to market, to export. It was just a mess. There was a ruler, Christian rulers, that were sitting up in their castles and getting drunk and having fun, and the country was going into disarray. So that's why the Muslims were able to take it over very quickly with the Jewish help, and they got to administrating very quickly. And in 20, 40 years, it became a beautiful, beautiful place with a lot of resources, produce, and again, they reached food security. Every nation has to reach food security before they can export and then get all the things that they don't have. And they amassed riches, and they planted trees from other parts of the world, and they were soon exporting those, and they were very lucrative. They had paved streets, they had lights at night, not electricity obviously, but they had a system where somebody was going to go and light lights, so the streets are illuminated in their capital city, which was Cordoba. And it's a beautiful place known in literature as Al-Andalus, Andalusia. Even today, it's called Andalusia in Spain. It's a smaller region, but this was the kingdom at the time. And people heard about it, as far away as in England, and it was sounded like a fantasy place, and it was just, how could that be that you're running water in a home? The Romans had this, but again, this had fallen apart. Medieval Europe at this time in the 9th and 10th centuries, if you're living in a castle, it's one thing, but they don't have running water, or it's a very different type of a place. They have the feudal system. Here in the Arab world, the Jews are living, and they are not restricted in land ownership and what they do for a living. Many people are part of shipping families, and they're part of this export business, import-export business, and they go far and wide. And this foreign secretary of Hasdai ibn Shaprut, he has correspondence with all the sages who, ironically, are not The Jerusalem is a thing. Jerusalem is a city we spoke about a little bit last week, in Muslim hands. But because the Muslim Empire is in control of that region at the time. They're fighting with the Byzantines, so it's a rural place. Just hang on one second. My map's closed. I wanted to show you another map. So what happens is he's writing letters as he's conducting business to people all over the world. And Hasdai ibn Shapur does good for his kingdom, and of course he's the head of the Jewish community. And this is a cute little map. I hope you could see it. The light blue is the land, dark blue is the water. So Spain is right here, the peninsula on the end. And of course the yellow, or brown, is this kingdom of the Khazars. I think it's up near the Black Sea. A different part of Eurasia. And the Khazars, he had correspondence. We found this today. He actually got letters from this kingdom, because the merchants were going back and forth, saying, they said, we're seeing merchants, and we're hearing there's all this fighting between the Byzantines and the Muslims, and we're deciding whether or not we should convert to a different religion. They were like a pagan people, and they decide through correspondence and through emissaries to convert to Judaism. And at some point, this was written down in a famous book called the Kuzari, written by a man that we're going to talk about, Yehuda Halevi, who everyone hears about in school. But he writes about this story, and people said, oh, it's a fabled kingdom. But now we do have, as years pass and more is discovered in the Cairo Geniza, where they stored papers for centuries, we found papers. And also a lot of stuff from Russia has been opened up to us since the fall of the Soviet Union in the past 40, 50 years. And they're finding evidence that there really, was a kingdom, and they decided to convert to some sort of version of Judaism. We don't know how extent, but that's how far and wide and how noble this idea of Judaism was. So they thought, so it was not looked upon in Spain. It was like an exalted position. Even though you were not a Muslim and getting full rights, it was like right there. You were fine. You're not supposed to wear a sword in public, we talked about. You're supposed to get off the sidewalk if a Muslim is coming and you're a Jew. You're supposed to dress a little differently. But a lot of these rules are not really adhered to in Spain at this time. Excuse me, Elise?
On the books, but maybe not.
Right, on the books, but people are not practicing.
Who was in power.
Exactly.
How open they were.
Exactly. So in Spain, it's a very a place, again, you show smarts, and a lot of learning was going on. There were lots of libraries, meaning universities and books, thousands and thousands. And the Jews also played a very prominent role in translating from the ancient Greek that the books were written in into Arabic, so that they were these go-between people. So they're serving as translators, and they're also serving as foreign agents and as intellectuals. Medieval Europe, different things are going on. They're not allowed to own land. They are reduced to being treated as the other. They're always this people the Christians look at them as, say, you must convert. And until you convert, by rule of St. Augustine, right, we're going to keep you alive, we're going to keep you around, just to show people how we want to oppress people who don't believe in JC.
How old was Christianity at that time?
So if we're talking 9th century, Christianity really began with Jesus in a little before 70. So year 0 was supposed to be the year of his birth, right?
Right.
So figure if we're in 9th century, Christianity,
900 years.
right, it went from a fringe thing to about 323 to the state religion of the Roman Empire. So, they are still in their zealous period. basically, oppressing Jews. They are the other that didn't accept.
We need a class on that, but they don't like to do that.
They don't, and it's
I don't blame 'em.
interesting.
I mean,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
understand it.
yeah. And
Why
the,
should we give all that attention? It was
It's
a
not the
Jew.
attention, but it's the idea of knowing
Yeah,
what
of
it
knowing the
really is.
source, yeah.
well, there's a lot of tumult that happens because of that in their early writings of were Jews who fell into that branch, basically, and they're yelling at each other, and it causes acrimony today. And I'll talk about this right now. I'm glad, a good segue, because when they were Christianity's just beginning, but really there was in ancient times, in the years that we just spoke about, the years 70 and 132, those years, there was a Greek lawyer, and his name was Apion. And he wrote about Jews. He hated them. And the Roman Empire was okay with people being a little different as long as they, adhered to Rome. But he talked about them so badly. He was the one who said, Jews have a custom yearly of kidnapping someone and making a sacrifice every spring and using their blood in things. Right away, the Jewish historian Josephus right away writes his whole history of the Jews. Josephus was the historian of the Emperor Flavius. He was a prominent man. Right away, he has books against Apion, saying, "Don't put this in a, forget this idea. This is horrible." So in 1142, getting more into the time period that we're talking about, by medieval times, it's just that little secret Greek writing that exists. In England, the first, the blood libel is created. The first blood libel occurs, just to juxtapose what's going on in Spain. In England, the blood libel begins because a knight goes on crusade. And the crusade was to liberate Jerusalem. We'll talk about a little bit the effects of European Jews, but for a second, he comes back, and they had failed in their crusades, and it was this big adventure, and he owes money to a Jewish moneylender in Norwich, in England, and this knight, he doesn't have the money to pay this man back, and a couple of towns over, there's a dead body that's found, and he comes up with this idea. We have to understand, knights were, if the king is the ruler, the knights are the mid-tier. Think of a pyramid. This is the way the society is structured. It's a feudal system. The king and the knights, and then you have clergy somewhere in there. You have peasantry. This knight, they have a little bit of education. They may know Latin and Greek. They're not the moronic masses necessarily, and he's the one who puts two and two together and says, well, him and his lawyer said, why don't we do this? Why don't we blame that body on the Jew? It's the right time of year. Maybe we could, make up a story. And they actually have this tribunal, this court, saying, I just came back from the East. I just came back from crusade. I saw they do this. This is written about. Right? This is written about, and they tried to squelch this. They don't want us to know. Josephus was a Jew, right? He tried to put this in, this whole idea. They don't want us to know. They actually kill people, and they drink the blood. And that's what they were doing. And that's what this money lender, he's a part of this. And I don't want to pay him. I'm telling you, he's the guy who did this.
They're only too happy to hang on to that and keep it
So
and believe it, and
this
it's
became
still
it.
today.
This
They say it
became.
till today.
So this revived it in medieval Europe. All the Jews of England are as a result of this are expelled, and the blood libel takes on its new life. This
And by
becomes
way,
the
British
accusation.
have a very famous pudding, which is black pudding. This
Blood pudding.
It's blood pudding.
Blood pudding, they
I
call
was
it.
reading, I couldn't believe it. I saw it on a show.
Yeah,
First
explain
cooking
it.
show, they
Explain it.
really
But
do put blood in the
yeah, they
animal. I don't know. No, they do. They make it till today.
You're talking about regions where the people are not necessarily able to eat everything that we eat. Again, Northern England, rocky areas, if they're going to slaughter a cow, they're going to use every single part of that cow. So even drinking, when the Torah talks about
And cooking it,
don't
the
drink the
pot.
blood of a live animal, we don't do those things. That was difficult for people living in rough regions. I mean, Jews never did that, but that becomes part of their culture. Again, here's these people who are not doing exactly what we're doing in all ways of life. And they were suspicious to them, and so, that's what's going on. Of course, a lot of those English Jews will end up in Spain. They are going to say, it's good there. There is a big influx of people that said, we're going to go where it's good. We're going to go where it's good. So Hasdai ibn Shaprut was a foreign secretary, and people can't even make a living, and they're being accused of being, bloodthirsty and the most heinous thing. Because you have very ignorant masses. Sure, you're going to have that in Spain. You have a peasant working class as well, sure. But there's not this intellectual class that would never happen in that culture. So we could also let's talk about Yehuda Halevi, who wrote that book about the Khazars. So it turns out that it was a true story, and he was writing a fictional account. Yehuda Halevi is one of our most famous Jewish poets, and I want to relate this to Zion because very famously people know his poems about my heart is in the east, but I am shackled in the east, and my heart is in the west. Really, I want to be in Zion, and we think of him as the quintessential, poet. He's in the time period where he's in medieval Spain. He's not born in Al-Andalus. He's born in Toledo, and he comes to that area in Cordoba, and he's sitting with these intellectuals and all these philosophers. In his youth, it wasn't about Zion for him. It was about making a name for himself, and he was this intellectual, and he studied, and he was a philosopher, and he even wrote a lot of poetry. He and many of the other poets at the time, and a lot of the poetry is not just religious poetry in nature. Much of it was, but in the early stages, a lot of them were just also impressing the society around them. And they also wrote poetry about love and about, sweethearts and nature and vision. And we don't think about this often. We say, he's a sage. He wrote books against philosophy. And that's used that's spoken of very often. People say, because he does have in that book, the Kuzari, a rejection of a lot of the philosophy that was being talked about in these libraries and these universities. He does talk about it. He has a fictional account in the book about the king of the Khazars bringing a Jew and a Muslim and a Christian in front of his court, and he fictionalizes this scene that happened in reality about which religion is the best. And he quickly dismisses the Christian and even the Muslim, and it's basically Judaism refuting philosophy. And what it turns out to be, it's about Aristotelian philosophy, if you really want to get into it, because that was the big debate of their day, was Aristotle, is scientifically correct in his philosophies or not, and about is there a God, and about our experiences as people, and what do we experience, and what's beyond the skies, and all these type of things. And he rejected a lot of it, and he rejected a lot of the integrated culture that he saw as he got older. That a lot of these people that sat in the salons, well, you have scholars, men who wrote poetry and then wrote biblical commentary, like the Ibn Ezra family. They did that who he became very friendly with, and even his daughter married into the family, married one of their sons.
What, Jew?
Yeah, Ibn Ezra, Yehuda Halevi. But other poets, there were poets who were very confused and were very lax in their Jewish Torah study and in their behavior. You're in an integrated society, you're cosmopolitan, it happens.
Like every.
It happens. We're not alone. So those characters who become famous for being the Sephardic scholar, the Sephardic integrated scholar. They're these people who are walking that fine line. A generation later, we're going to hear about Rambam. When he talks about the golden mean, he's very fully aware of the pitfalls of that kind of lifestyle, where you can just get lost in the secular, what we call today the secularness, even amongst the Muslims. And, in terms of, you can just agree with them so much that you're losing yourself and not going back to your Torah values, or, that is always a danger. So you've got to be very careful and work very hard not to be. It's not for everybody. It is for an upper echelon. So Yehuda Halevi, I just want to tell you, we know famously that at the end of his life he does travel and goes to Zion. He goes and he returns to Eretz Israel. And there's a fable about the idea that he gets there at the gates of the city and he gets trampled by a horse, and tragically he doesn't get to experience it. And it's a fable. and it takes hold because people grab onto these narratives, like it just sounds so, the wandering Jew, and he must have suffered because he wrote about his chains in his poetry, or in the West, but he finally got there. And it's really not reality, because the reality was he lived a very sophisticated lifestyle. He lived well. He was not a suffering person. He was not persecuted, and he was not kicked out from town to town. He just had this yearning because he just rejected some of the philosophical, intellectual debate of his day. He decided really towards the end of his life, he lived into his 60s, which is definitely an old age at those days. And he traveled to Egypt, and he was hosted, he and his son-in-law, from the Ibn Ezra family. His name was Yitzchak Ibn Ezra. And it's interesting, the son-in-law is traveling with him, and we know that Yehuda Halevi stayed there and he was hosted and everyone greeted him. He was this famous poet and they gave him great honors and he was doing very well, and they begged him, please stay with us here in Egypt. We'll let you be our poet. You're an older man. Don't go to Israel. It's a backwater. It's in Muslim hands, but it's just a rural place. They're not building this up. It's not a city. For a man of your age or stature, stay here with us. There's nothing going on over there. No, he wants to go and see Jerusalem. And his son-in-law, Yitzchak Ibn Ezra, now I don't know where the wife is, his son-in-law actually goes to Baghdad, where Iraqi Judaism is still there. The community lasted up until the 1951, okay? So they were there, they were strong, they were flourishing. Most of the scholars had gone to Spain or North Africa or to Europe, but there were scholars, and he went and he started to study with a wise rabbi over in Baghdad. He's not returning home to his wife. You get the sense that he's a troubled man, because tragically, this man, Yitzchak Ibn Ezra, converts to Islam. It's a bad story. It's pretty bad. Yehuda Halevi doesn't know this because he goes on to Jerusalem, where his son-in-law's in Baghdad. The news reaches Spain about 3 years later, and his father, I believe it's Moshe Ibn Ezra, one of the biblical commentaries, and poets, and he has tragic poetry written about. It's 60 verses long. These poems where he gets to the point that he's just horrified that his son, made that horrible jump.
Do we assume the Ibn Ezra family of the commentary?
Yeah, this is who we're talking about. I mean, again, they don't. So it's a.
Did he ever see him again?
No, he died. He actually dies. The son who converted. He converted and he died a little after. So we're not sure what the reason of the conversions. They have writings again that came out from Russia. Yeah.
I don't want to believe it.
Right. So the historians, so I'm looking at something where a lot, They're talking about politics and change, about the caliphate in Iraq, and the role that the Jewish community played. Historians know this, and they're looking at writings about it, and they're talking about the famous people that were there, and they do know that he did convert, and the news reached the family, and they were horrified. And they were horrified because here they are trying to be this unbelievable model. Yeah, it reaches 3 years to get back to Spain. So there is a danger, but I think it's worth pointing out they navigated these waters before. Too many of our young people like to think, or when they first discover different ways of thinking, or something that sounds interesting, a new philosophy of life, think, well, Judaism is so old-fashioned, it's so old world, we're into new stuff now, we know better now, and so much is out there, and we're not saying they threw it all away, these Spanish Jews. They said, another one was lost, but we got to work harder. There is a way to navigate. There is great flourishing and great learning and great work done. But the character became, you don't just throw it all out because of some bad stories. There are, whereas again, we could juxtapose other communities,
I was gonna ask,
especially,
say Eastern European Jewry,
yeah,
there was a big divide.
tremendous.
One way they went extremely religious and the other went very secular.
Definitely,
And that's how
there was
the
no
nation-
split here,
Right.
between secular and your
Those
religious
days,
song.
everybody was very orthodox. If you were Jewish,
So,
there's
so
no reform or
this
conservative
time
now.
period, you must have a religion to your name. It's not like we're confusing what happens in the Enlightenment in the late 1700s. Now they're choosing, should I be religious or not? So everybody must have a religious moniker attached to their name. Whether or not they're fully attending their synagogue, their mosque, their church, and whether they're known for it. But whether or not they to go jump to another side, what's going on, and now again, Yehuda Halevi was very brilliant in saying there's a fourth thing here. There's philosophy. He's very brilliant in saying there's a whole nother venue here that's very dangerous. They could just drop off completely. He knew it. He understood that in his old age, and he rejected. He says this is too dangerous. His son, and this he must have. I believe his son-in-law must have been a troubled man to begin with. If this had happened to him, anyway, it's known. They say that he did actually live in Jerusalem for about a month, and he was an older man, and he did die soon afterwards. We don't know natural causes. The diseases went around. Again, if you made it to 65, wow, in those days, as it was. So there's that. When he dies at about 1141, I looked it up right before I came. I can't remember these numbers right ahead. Rambam is born a year in 1138. So he was a baby when Yehuda Halevi's already dying. Harambam is born in Spain, in that beautiful place in Cordoba.
Wait, what year is Rambam born?
1138. So Yehuda Halevi's an old man traveling to Israel at that time, and he's just a child. Harambam was born in Cordoba, brilliant family, got the best education possible. He was primed to be, this type of
And
leader.
he was a doctor?
So physician meant you knew every known science or interaction or everything you knew about.
Doesn't mean he was an actual
And he was. They became healers and also knowing properties, but they were expected also to know about the stars, and that's called a physician as also. It's like the word physician was like all encompassing. It was a larger word. And you're a wise physician, so come heal me. So it was an but yes, he definitely knew all about the body. But in his day, unfortunately, a good thing never lasts forever. Extremist Muslims came in from North Africa. The Berbers came in and they overran the caliphate in Spain, and they basically broke it up. And they tried to take control, and all of a sudden in Cordoba, went from a nice tolerant place, even though Muslim religion says you're supposed to be tolerant to these dhimmis, protect them, give them the second-class citizenship, let them be their religion. They were like, no, we have to, everybody must be Muslim or leave or die. That's the choice. That's what these extremists did. This shows up a couple of times. It'll last a few years, 20 years. It's a person's lifetime. And then it'll fade away because the next generation will never keep it up. You understand? They'll become more tolerant. But in his youth, the father of Maimonides, he was a younger man, I would say he was a teenager or a youth. He's got this world-class education. The father decides, instead of going to the Christian north, I'm going to go south to the Muslim world. I'm going to go to North Africa, and he makes a different choice. It's him and his two sons. You don't really hear about a mother after a while, and they make their way all across North Africa, and he ends up in Egypt, where they're able to reemerge as a full-fledged Jew, participating, practicing his religion. It was all
So Harambam wrote all his material living in Egypt?
Yeah, maybe also on the road, on the run. And so he that's how he ends up there, and that's why he writes letters when they ask him questions. We talked about last time about Yemen, where it's situated at the bottom of Arabia. They also were dealing all of a sudden. There were these sailors that were going all around the oceans and the Red Sea and traders, and all of a sudden they were being forced to convert. Can we falsely convert? They write their letters to Rambam. Of course, he's very forgiving. That was his personal experience as well, saying, it's a monotheistic vow you've got to take. That's not so bad as compared to, having to vow for Christianity. You can't do that because they believe in, it's a triumvirate, and it's a little bit confused there. That it's an avodah zarah type of a monotheistic thing that they've got going on. Right. So
even though today,
right. Right. If you ask a Christian, they say, I believe in one God, but technically, yeah,
The Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost.
Yeah.
it's in their
I
theology.
just explained it to my grandson the other day. He goes, "What's a Holy Ghost?"
Yeah.
I don't think
Yeah.
anything now.
Yeah. Well, it depends on how learned they are into the Roman Catholic Church. So and also when you have people walking around buildings, and you have to be very careful how you say it loud.
No, of course.
So there's definitely, to us, there's a lot of avodah zarah in there. So however I'm saying, so you definitely could, falsify to get to and he's saying, do what I did, basically. Keep the reason. Again, that characteristic of do what you gotta do to survive. You're in a empire and society that you can deal with in in the Muslim world. It creates a different personality, not just with him. We're looking at him because he personifies the generation or a few generations. People were doing this, and when they all across North Africa, you have Jews being physicians and administering to people, and they have a very good name for themselves, and they're serving mayors and leaders, and they're fine. Other areas of Spain still have a lot of Jews in them, and different regions, different things. So
we say like our community, our grandparents, and even those who immigrated and ended up coming here, were they living under dhimmi in let's say a kind of dhimmi state?
So
because they did become doctors.
I'll say at this point. So at this point, you still have indigenous people living in the Middle East, Eretz Yisrael, what we think of as Lebanon, as what we think as Iraq, huge community, the Baghdadi community, and in Aleppo. Harambam writes about Aleppo. He says that there's few people in the world that study Talmud correctly anymore. He says there are people in Aleppo that do it, but they don't. They study it, but they don't take it seriously enough. In his day, he was a little bit upset about them. He's talking about the codex. He saw the famous Aleppo Codex. I don't want to get into that whole discussion, but he actually saw it, and before it was sent to Syria and made its travels and was there for safekeeping. So there was an indigenous community. At this point, they do not have any Sephardic culture to them at all. They are what we call these Mustarav, meaning they are Arabic culture Jews that are there indigenously since the time of King David. And as the destruction of the temple and centuries are passing, there are more Jews joining it. It's in a trade town. It's a stop on the trading post, Aleppo.
But they lived
At Damascus for sure.
But they were thriving economically.
Yeah, they're surviving, but it's not on the sea. There's no, so the Sephardic Jews are not, they may be passing through, but there's no community of Spanish. That's not happening yet.
Right.
It's going to happen in the 1800s, in the earlier 1700s.
Right. So I'm just saying,
Yeah.
in modern times.
In 1492
our
also, yeah.
Great-grandparents.
Yeah.
They were allowed to thrive and live under the laws of Dhimmi.
Absolutely. So
But-
they were all Dhimmi.
But by the time they all immigrated, I'm saying right after all those, no more, you cannot.
Your
imagine any Jews
great-grandparents-
living under Dhimmi
Dhimmi
anymore.
ended in 1839.
Dhimmi ended.
Dhimmi,
What?
second, you gotta go.
No.
Kids. Yeah. I know, the moms have to go. I
No,
know.
I'm saying that you can't imagine that Dhimmi stayed, by the time everybody immigrated and.
In the 19, it was
Escape.
gone already. 1839,
Yeah.
Dhimmi ends in the Ottoman Empire.
So they're living.
No, they had other problems. The
Yeah.
Syrians
Right,
and
but
the-
first of all, the legacy of that lasts. You're jumping. See,
Yeah,
I said it's a great way.
Yeah, once Israel became a state.
So by going in order, you realize they are all living under Dhimmi rules, and look, it's not perfect. There's going to be times when people do bother them,
Yeah.
but it holds up in a court of law. There is
Except
some
that,
sort of
like Rochelle said, by the time
system.
Israel became a state again, I think that's
Mhm.
going much later already, but by then, they had to hate the Jews already.
Well,
As long as we were like kept down.
It's
and
so
quiet.
much you're just lumping together.
Yeah.
There's acrimony caused by a lot of different
Yeah.
foreign elements.
Yeah.
And there's individuals and there's famous cases. And again, but then the Sephardic thing, it doesn't start. I promise you, I'm going to do that next. I think it's great to do it in order, because if you do it at this point, it's just indigenous Jews there. They're very Arabic culture, just like they love the music, they're eating those foods, they're dressing
Yeah.
as much the same as they're allowed, just like anywhere else.
Yeah.
But they have the benefit that they've never left the region. Whereas Jews that are living in Germany and France, all the people are newcomers there. You know what I'm saying? So they're dressing as Europeans, and they're taking on what they can take on. The Crusades had created a terrible situation that where Jews become vilified, they can't hold up their head, and now this blood libel thing is just going to keep popping up everywhere where they're welcomed in to be money lenders and to be economic base for people. And then they cross somebody and somebody doesn't want to pay their debts. It's an old story. Then they're kicked out or they're mistreated. Sometimes it's just about survival, and just about you don't have that luxury of even losing people in an integrated society like I'm describing in the Sephardic world, because they're like, they don't want you in that world. They're not going to let you get to that even level where they're going to deal with you as little as possible. You are the other. Obviously, there's going to be pockets and places where there's a very, generous and benevolent person that wants to go forward. But if you're talking about German and French, and the whole Polish thing, though, is an exception, if you really want to ask. Poland becomes a beautiful place where a lot of Jews flock to, because even though the Catholic Church is in charge of it, they want to grow the country and the economy. They allow Jews to come, and the Jews develop this beautiful autonomy, and it lasts hundreds of years. Yiddish culture grows. They're allowed to be farmers. They are allowed to be craftsmen, and they have visitors who come and they're like, I can't believe that Jew's like talking and he's building something like a normal person. They couldn't believe it. Just let them be. bad times don't start for the Jews in Poland, I believe, until the Ukrainian revolts in the 1600s. I always pronounce Kamenetsky uprisings, the Ukrainian uprisings, where they attack the Jews of Poland, not because it's because the Polish priests were trying to export their religion into the Ukraine, and the Ukrainians are like, we're Greek Orthodox, we don't want Catholicism, follow this. So we're going to attack the Catholic Church in Poland. But you know what? We're going to get them where it hurts, in their money. Who's their money base? The Jews. It wasn't, which is the weirdest thing, it wasn't necessarily against Jews in the beginning, but they want to affect their economic base. And then when these horrible, horrible riots started, life began to change. That place that was so flourishing changed. You have something to add? I'd love to, hear, if anyone has any thoughts about it, because there's a lot of rich heritage, and they lived very, very well, in Poland. So that wasn't an Eastern European exception. You wonder, like, why are so many Jews in that region? They were welcomed. And it's on the border, we're going to see of the Ottoman Empire, and we'll talk about it.
I have a Polish contract that was so nice,
Mhm.
and very nice, and always told me his great-grandparents, his grandparents, whatever, they sheltered the Jews during the war. But I just have one question that we learned in our history books, and they taught us in school. He was a little boy.
Sure.
Why did they go so willingly to the gas chambers?
Right,
I go,
right.
why?
This is the problem.
I never forgot this
but it
conversation.
is,
He goes, they
It's a
went
big problem.
willingly. I go,
It's a big
"Look,
problem.
you have a gun at your head. A person doesn't know till last minute if they're going to survive something or not. You can't just, why they didn't rebel, why they were so meek. And he's a
It's so
nice
sad
person.
because
He's
they
such a
don't
nice person.
learn about the
No,
Holocaust
they learn in
history
their books.
enough. They just say the Jews are weak, this
No, they
this
learn the
narrative,
opposite.
Jews are weak people, and they just went willingly, and
Yeah,
they don't want
it
to
says
talk
it in
about
their
their
history books.
role
That's what it
in the
says.
slow development
That's
of
what they learn in
that
elementary
whole
school.
system, and people
They
didn't
just
know
went
what was
willingly to the
happening.
depths. They went
People
willingly.
didn't know.
He goes, we learned it in our
Yeah.
history books. I go, it doesn't make it a fact.
And it
doesn't
doesn't
make
help.
it a true fact.
It doesn't help that for the
They
first
don't get
30 years of Holocaust history, they taught it in a way of victimhood, from the narrative of victimhood. Now, if you talk about Yad Vashem,
Interesting,
a very big change has happened in our generation. How it's talked about from the fighting angle, from the resistance angle, and we learn more about this industrial psychology that was going on, and propaganda, and how even nobody understood. It happens in stages, and when you get to it, you have no idea what's going on the other end of it, and things like that. So but it's a long. This doesn't fit into a soundbite on an Instagram post, and this is the big problem today: is that the conversation has got so dummied down.
It's gotta be one sentence for everything.
Yeah. So if we stick with this next week, I would talk about what happens in the later medieval period, 1492, and about that Sephardic diaspora. So you have this early one of the Rambam in the early medieval, this medieval period, and then again 300 years later, a second wave. This first wave, it's not a Spanish influence. It's just these Jewish scholars living in this Arabized world, but very different in nature. And again, these personalities are already talking about Zion, not from a point of, for that theme of the class I wanted to attack, is not, they're talking about Zion not as it's my salvation, get me there, because they're oppressing me. That may be going on in other places. They're talking about it as this dream. It's in the hands of the people who are running my country. Why shouldn't I go there? Maybe that's the place for me. And it's a vision. I'll go there and do what God wants me to do, and I'll see what's next. It's not from a point of view of oppression. And their poetry is about getting there and being,
So don't we
just
still
seeing
feel
what's
that
there.
way?
Excuse me?
Don't we still feel that way?
Of course. But I think the point of strength, again, if we don't want to talk about Jews, is always the victimology. The narrative is, we always looked at it as victims. They also looked at it as that's a goal. I have food security. I have a mansion here in diaspora in Spain. I have lights at night. I can walk the street. I'm safe. I should be thinking about Eretz Israel as well. That they were just like us in that sense, saying, not as a place of refuge, that's my religious obligation as well.
Right.
And I should address that, and that's going to help me maybe navigate this integrated lifestyle where so many of our youth are getting lost. That's a part of it, at least. And that's, I think it's a point of strength, and I think we have to erase the victim and the impoverished, kicked around Jew
Or you have to-
personality.
or you have both of them.
We have to add it. We got to add it, and that's been missing for so
Nobody
long.
respects the victim or
Yeah, and we
anybody
make
involved.
jokes about it. Oh, you know, Jews don't do those kind of things. We're just weaklings. No, I like that. No,
the
Jews
world
are
respects-
the conquerors.
the
Jews,
world respects
I shouldn't say
the
conquerors.
best.
Excuse
The
me.
world respects
Jews are
the best.
warriors. Jews can hold their own. Jews,
And that's what the world respects.
and we
That's
the
what-
businessmen, the models, the money makers. So with that, I'll end because I know Rabbi Nathan comes and makes
Thank you.
plans.
I'd rather sit in
Thank you.
here,